Hi, everybody, and welcome back to week two of Fiction in the Global City unit. We are moving on this week to look at Don DeLillo's very short novel, Cosmopolis. I just wanted to very briefly talk about this novel in relation to Open City, because that's what you're going to be doing in your discussion forum. I'm putting up this video and the discussion forum slightly early this week because I'm going to be on a plane tomorrow, and I'll be flying transatlantic, and by the time I arrive in, I don't think I'm going to be in anything resembling a human state. So I wanted to just have this material all ready to go. Just looking at your discussion forum on Open City and the theoretical text, I hope that it's a helpful way of approaching the text. My immediate response is that it is. Your discussions are really informed, and I really love the way that you guys engage with one another. Some of the discussion, especially in relation to Open City and Sassen's essay, has sort of focused in on the idea that the narrator is in some way a kind of vampiric figure, that he takes constantly from the city around him, and loses interest and has no sort of sense of engagement, and that this is, from what I can see, it seems to be regarded as both a flaw of the novel and a flaw of the character. Now, the character himself is quite a detached figure and kind of a complex figure. He's capable at times of great humanity and empathy, and at other times is very detached and very removed from the world around him, and very easily bored by, frankly, boring people. He sort of requires intellectual stimulation, and where he doesn't get it becomes very sort of detached. But as we see, he also has a sort of buried history from his upbringing, where in Nigeria, where he's sort of committed this great moral error, and caused a huge amount of pain in somebody else's life, and we never really hear him atone for that necessarily. What I would hope that would come out of the discussion, though, is a little more attention to the detail of what Sassen is saying makes a global city, which is not necessarily predicated on anything that an individual does or can do, but has a lot more to do with its imbrication into wider systems, into bigger processes like migration and like economic activity. And we can see a lot of that in Open City, the idea that this character is in some senses a product of a whole field of processes, like for one thing, global migration. He's not just an individual, but very much somebody conscious of his position within a global system of transnational migration. He's very much an in-between figure who is sort of at a remove from all identifications and all individual stances and positions. That, in other words, his sense of distance may in fact be produced by his place within that world system, rather than being just a character flaw. The other thing is that if you're reading what people have written about George Simmel's work, Simmel says that one of the sort of characteristic features of the city is that it produces a sense of detachment in individuals, and that sense of detachment is a feature of urban life, a necessary survival mechanism, that in order to live and maintain a sense of one's individuality and one's humanity in a large and alienating and overwhelming sensory experience like a city, it's necessary to maintain a sense of intellectual distance from those around us. And that, again, that means that the cityscape itself is in some ways producing this individual. Now, that has two effects in terms of how we decide to read that text. One is that it forces us to consider this main character not just as a sort of annoying bad guy or whatever, but rather as somebody who is in some ways typical of the urban. He is a sort of urban subject. And in another way, it's to say that, well, he's also an urban subject has transnational migration and other such things inscribed on him, right? That he is simultaneously American and Nigerian and so on, and so doesn't really feel a sense of easy identification with other people. And we see him push back frequently against any attempt by others to establish a sense of solidarity. So very often other immigrants call him brother or things like that, and he sort of recoils from that, and he seems very much uncomfortable with those sort of easy identifications. And that may be why we find him so difficult to identify with ourselves. Um, the other thing that I wanted to talk about Open City in relation to is that if it's in some ways mediating this aspect of the world system, immigration and transnationalism and so on, it's it's interesting to juxtapose that with this week's novel, which is Cosmopolis. Because Cosmopolis tells the story of this character who's very much he's a financier for one thing, but he's also a kind of whiz kid. And his experience of the city is filtered through the lens of global finance. And he's very much a kind of fantasist. One of the things that, I mean, increasingly, the city is a sort of site in which in which we like which is shaped, let's say, by global finance, that the actions of the financial world increasingly shape our social lives, the spaces around us, the way the world is run, the decisions that are made at the very top levels, and so on, right? And one of the arguments that's made about global finance is that in some ways it is an abstracting force, that because things like securities and credit default swaps and all of these types of financial transactions are at an increasing remove from productive economic activity, that they are, in a sense, abstract actions, that wealth is being generated without any activity really taking place, right? And that in doing this, it renders the world economy much more abstract. So the world economy is something like 90% determined by financial activity, that is value that is extracted or created purely through financial transactions and financial instruments, rather than any actual productive activity like factories making cars and things like that. In fact, even car companies are a good example of this. They no longer make money from their cars, they make money from financing the purchase of cars. So increasingly the markets, activities within the markets take place at lightning fast paces across the world. They're carried out on computers, so that all of this activity is virtualized, is microsecond fast, is increasingly carried out algorithmically rather than by human individuals. In other words, the things that determine our economic fate are increasingly at a remove from our everyday experience. That's the argument of some theorists of global finance. In Cosmopolis, we can see this at work when you look at the main character, who right now just his name fell out of my head, but he leaves his condominium, his penthouse apartment in the morning, and gets into a limousine to cross town. he has some business to attend to, but he specifically wants to get his hair cut, right? And he's a sort of really odd figure. He's a young guy, but he's clearly a sort of financial genius, or he's regarded as such. And he is taking a massive risk on the yen, and and as the day goes by, it becomes clear that the yen is about to self-destruct, and he's going to lose a huge amount of money for his company at the time. But what's interesting is that his experience of the city is filtered through this idea of abstraction, this notion that that real lived experience, and by extension, real concrete space and real human interactions and engagements, are becoming less and less important and falling away, and they're being replaced by a kind of a sort of financialized abstract world, a sort of virtualized world that he feels he has some kind of sense of connection to, and he kind of fantasizes about the notion that that human connection and human interactivity and human space and so on will in some ways wither away and disappear and be replaced by the pure flow of numbers, the pure circulation of finance. That the sort of friction of humanity will in some ways sort of fall away, and everything he sees out the window of his limo is filtered through a kind of disdain for the city around him, but also a kind of an an odd resistance that's pushing back. Right, that there's a sense that the physicality, the dirtiness, and the inconvenience of the city keeps pushing back against the windows of his limousine. That idea of an abstract cityscape just will not materialize for him, or the cityscape won't dematerialize for him. And that's quite clearly in tension with Teju Cole's vision of the city, where it's very much shaped by random encounters, human engagements, meetings with people, often random meetings with people, and it's very physical, it's very tactile, it's very much shaped by his walking the city as opposed to driving it. He doesn't get into a car; he gets on public transport sometimes, but both of these narrators are in one way or another shaped by the world system, whether that's transnational migration or whether that's global finance. And those two systems are related, right? But they give rise to two very different visions of the city, and as a result, two very different ways of narrativizing the city, or of writing about the city. And what I'm interested in looking at, or in you guys discussing, is what the difference is between these two novels, and what are the similarities between these two novels in terms of how they envision New York as a result of their imbrication into these sort of world systems, finance, or transnational migration. Okay, so what you're going to be doing is there's again going to be three groups. The groups have been sort of shuffled slightly, and I'll keep shuffling these groups in any group activity that you do. You're going to be just comparing and contrasting the treatment of a theme or a concept related to the global city in these two novels. So as a group, you're going to decide on what concept is of interest to you in relation to both novels. I've listed a couple of possibilities, like focusing on the perspective of the protagonists as flaneurs, or considering how their cultural and economic positions affect how they perceive the city around them. Or you could compare how each narrative portrays the idea of psychological alienation, right? Because both of these protagonists are alienated from the city, but in very, very different ways and for very, very different reasons. You could also talk about their contrasting representations of space. And, you know, there's also, those are some suggestions that I make, but if you have other ideas, feel free to run them by me. I really want to hear what you have to say about that. And, you know, using that as a way to begin exploring these novels, and especially to begin exploring the idea of the global city on your own terms. So you're not obliged to follow one of my suggestions or anything like that. It's just, well, what strikes you about these novels that they're dealing with similar themes or similar issues, but maybe are doing so in very different ways, and being able to compare and contrast those treatments, right? The assignment, then I have directions written down for the assignment, but basically the first person will write about 100 words explaining how the theme plays out in Open City. And again, drawing on direct evidence from the text in your analysis and explaining what it reveals. The second person will write 100 words in reply on the same issue in relation to Cosmopolis. So first person will write about Open City, the second person will write about Cosmopolis. The third person will then synthesize the two brief discussions. So they'll reply to the thread and explain in clear terms what similarities and differences they reveal between the novels, and what we might conclude about their representation of the global city from that comparison. So you should discuss this stuff as a group in advance of doing your post, decide on what theme you want to discuss, talk through your thoughts on it and all of that sort of stuff, right? But when you go to post on the discussion forum, that's the format that it'll follow. You'll then write responses to your other classmates' threads, right? So you should write a 100-word response to each of the other groups, building on their ideas or offering alternative perspectives, and generally progressing the discussion, okay? And the last thing that you want to do is that you can each go back to your original thread and write a 50-word reply to the contributions that have been put in before, summing up what you've gained from them or the ways in which you disagree. And again, I do want to emphasize disagreement is a good thing. Make sure to feel free to do that. The grading for this will be, there's a rubric for it, but it's basically critical thinking and inquiry will be 1/3 of your grade, your ability to think through the text, explain, beyond just what happens in it, your ability to engage with complex issues and allow that to inform your analysis of the text. And part will be for how effectively you engage with others, in other words, how you build upon what other people do or take issue with it or offer alternative perspectives to what they've said. And the final part will be how you draw upon other texts than the primary text, okay? So that's an important aspect of this. 1/3 of your grade will be your ability to bring in other materials, right? So you have looked at a couple of secondary sources last week, some theoretical materials. There's also a whole bunch of other readings in this unit that you could look at. There's things like Baudrillard, simulacra, and all of that. But there's also secondary readings by scholars writing about Cosmopolis or about Open City. That stuff is not compulsory reading. You don't have to read all of that stuff, but I would highly encourage you, especially if you're interested in one or other of these novels, to start looking at what stuff is there on the course module and thinking about, well, maybe I'm interested in that. Maybe that's offered a perspective I hadn't thought about before. Maybe that will help enhance our discussion. So part of your grade for this discussion forum will be your ability to bring in other materials than just the primary text, and to allow those things to inform the ongoing discussion. Okay, so as I say, I will try and contribute occasionally. I'll write some replies to you guys and stuff as we're going along. Probably be a little later in the week when you really get going. So, but hopefully over the weekend I'll have a chance to reply to some of you guys. As I say, I'm really happy with your first week's work. It's been great. I love it. I'm really glad to be doing this course with a bunch of people who are so positively engaged with these texts. It's really fun to, even people who don't like the novel. I know some of you are not fans of Open City. I don't really care if you don't like the novel, as long as you don't like it and are willing to analyze it and show why it doesn't work in your opinion. But I would ask also that you keep an open mind about what the novel is trying to do, and try not to dismiss the novel because you don't like the protagonist or something like that. You don't have to like the protagonist. Novelists are not necessarily trying to make likable protagonists either, but the main thing is I've been really engaged by what you've been saying. I really love the introductory forum too. I think that it was really fun to read what you guys had to say about all of that. So I'm looking forward to getting into the real work of starting to build upon that sort of foundational work we did in week one and really starting to engage with the text in a more sustained way. Okay, I'll talk to you guys during the week, and make sure to get in touch with me if anything isn't clear or you have any questions or anything like that. I'm happy to respond. Okay, bye.